All right. Well, I'm here with Dr. Matthew Barrett, Associate Professor of Christian Theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. My name is Charles Lee Irons. I'm the Senior Research Administrator at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science in Los Angeles. And I'm an independent scholar who studies biblical theology. It's great to be here with you, Dr. Barrett, to discuss your new book that is about to come out, Simply Trinity, and looking forward to discussing with you chapter 7, which deals with the topic of eternal generation.
Yeah, it's good to be with you as well. I'm really excited about us being able to talk like this because I know you've done quite a bit of work and research in the past years on this topic of eternal generation, and so I feel a bit. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you as well.
Good. So, eternal generation is an interesting phrase. Explain to us what is eternal generation, and especially the word generation. Eternal, we pretty much know, but what does generation refer to?
Yeah, it can be a strange concept when we're to Christians today who are maybe they're not used to using this language either in the pastorate or the church or even in the academy. We can get into this, but there's all kinds of reasons for that. The language has almost disappeared for a long time from our vocabulary, which I think if you go back in history would have just been inconceivable. I mean, if we would have, if we go back in time and could have said to one of the fathers, patristic, medieval, Reformation, it almost wouldn't matter that this language of begetting or eternal generation, there would come a day when it was foreign to Christians. They would have just been, I think they would have been baffled by it and a bit shocked and wanted to know more. Why is this happening? You've obviously done a lot in this area. I mean, I can think, for example, of just Bible Christians who read their Bible are just not going to see it anymore. But to answer your question, what is eternal generation, or sometimes we call it the eternal begetting of the Son. Well, it really comes back to the very names that Scripture gives to us. The names Father and Son. I think sometimes we just hear those names so much, right?
Yeah.
That we rarely stop to think, well, why are they called Father and Son? These persons. What does that even mean? And of course, the scriptural context, but even in our own, human context, the whole concept of begetting is actually not that foreign when we think about it. When we talk about begetting, well, here we're talking about the idea of coming forth from someone or something. When we're talking about persons in our own human experience, begetting or generating, this type of language is very familial. In other words, it brings us to those categories of a father and a son, for example, so that a son, well, what does it mean for a son to be a son? It means that this son is from his father. And but as you pointed out, when this concept this language is used of God, the eternal, infinite, incomprehensible God, well, there's still that truth there, but of course we have to be quick to qualify what we do and do not mean, lest we just assume whatever's true in our human begetting is just straight across true of God himself. that would be quite dangerous
No.
and would certainly domesticate God and humanize God, or historicize God in all kinds of ways. So when we refer to this idea of eternal generation, we're simply referring to the fact that the Son is from the Father, but from all eternity. There never was a time when the Father was without his Son. There never was a time when the Son was not Son, or the Father not Father. If we wanted to be a bit more Nicene in our vocabulary, we could say something like, from all eternity, the Son is begotten from the Father's essence. And that might be a bit more specific and
Yeah.
theological to say, yes, this is a begetting. It identifies the eternal origin, or the eternal relation of origin of the Son, from the Father, of course. But since this is the eternal Son that we are referring to, we immediately have to qualify that, well, contrary to Arianism and subordinationism, this is not you know univocal with our human
Right.
begetting. So how would you, I'd be curious, you've done a lot on this. I mean, how in the past, when maybe it's a churchgoer or a student approaches you and says, what is this idea, concept you're talking about, eternal generation or begetting, what do you say to them?
Well, one thing that I try to explain right at the beginning is that the word generation is a little bit abstract for us as English speakers, and it might help if we realize that that word is just from Latin, and it's just the Latin word for begetting.
Yeah.
And so eternal generation is the same thing as saying eternal begetting.
Yeah.
Or even eternal sonship, you could almost say.
Mm.
And so that kind of helps to sort of ease into it a little bit, so it doesn't sound so, for some reason, these Latin-based English words are so formal and almost philosophical that they kind of put us off a little bit. But if we just realize, no, there's nothing special about putting it in Latin. It's just it's just an ordinary way of explaining that there's this father-son relationship in which the father has a son. Sometimes there's another word that we use in English that might be helpful, although it's kind of agricultural, but it's the word sire.
Oh.
Right? When a father sires a son, usually that's used in the agricultural context in English.
Yeah.
But, like a horse or something. But siring is interesting because it sort of focuses on the father's role in having offspring.
Okay.
Right? So a mother doesn't sire a child, only a father sires a child. So using that metaphor, that kind of helps a little bit to focus even more specifically on what we're talking about.
Mm.
So so it's basically a metaphor. It's a metaphor from ordinary human experience that we're using as an analogy to understand the Trinity. And of course, as you said, we have to maintain the distinction between God as the infinite creator and the creatures. So there's all kinds of differences between human begetting and eternal begetting, but there's still that analogical relationship that kind of helps us to get a foothold here to understand what the scriptures are trying to say.
Yeah.
So that's how I usually approach it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you if you had any thoughts about what is the best way of trying to understand the scriptural basis of this doctrine? Like, is it just based on the phrase only begotten, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, or is there something broader that helps us to kind of fit everything together to understand this as a deeply rooted scriptural concept?
Yeah, that question right there, I think you've hit a nerve,
Yeah.
if I can put it that way,
Right.
because um, when we ask, well, why is this concept so foreign to us today? I think one reason, there's probably many reasons, but one reason is that when Christians today talk about it, they sometimes then go to the Bible, to the scriptures, with a certain methodology.
Right.
Um, in my experience, and this is something you can see in a lot of literature, even by evangelicals, the doctrine is approached in a very atomized manner. So we just assume, oh, we need to go to a specific verse, and there we're going to find the doctrine of eternal generation.
Yeah.
Um, this type of approach is, well, it will leave people very disappointed,
Right.
or worse, it'll leave people suspicious,
Yep.
and they may even reject the doctrine altogether because
Yep.
they feel like they can't find that chapter and verse for it. One of the things that I try to point out in Simply Trinity is that I think we're going about it all wrong. It certainly is the case that, yes, we do need, and I do this in the book, we do need to look at specific passages, absolutely. And I spend quite a bit of time doing that. However, before we get there, we need to kind of take a step back
Right.
and ask ourselves the question, well, how is not just eternal generation, but just the doctrine of the Trinity, how is it revealed to us? When we ask that question, we discover, well, it's not revealed to us in the way we might think or the way we might approach other doctrines. It's revealed to us a bit more holistically. So when we think about, just our conversation just now about the very names, we could ask, well, why do the scriptures and the New Testament in particular reveal these persons by these names? The names seem to say something, and as you just pointed out with Father and Son, that communicates quite a lot. And actually, the very essence of, well, probably shouldn't use that word, the very concept of eternal generation itself is it's embedded in those names, Father and
Yeah.
Son.
Right.
I think that's important to point out. I mean, it feels almost too simple to say, but I think it's important to point out because I think our tendency today is to look at Father, Son in our human society, and to make all kinds of assumptions about how we might define Father and Son in terms of functionality or social engagement. And the danger there is then we can read those back onto the eternal Father, Son, and then just assume that's what it means to be Father and Son. And then we completely miss the one thing it does mean, which comes back to this concept of begetting itself. The other thing I'll mention is when we open the scriptures, we see something like eternal generation revealed in a very natural way. The authors don't just come out and say, here it is, right? Rather, tied to the storyline of Scripture, they lay before us the missions of the persons of the Trinity,
Right.
the missions of Father, Son, and Spirit. The beautiful thing about this way of describing the triune God is obviously this has a lot to do with our salvation. That these missions are there for the sake of our redemption. But as these missions are the layers are peeled back, we then realize, oh, these missions actually are meant to point us to the eternal, immanent life of God and this distinction.
Right.
One of them being eternal generation, so that when we see that the Father sends his Son for the sake of our salvation, the biblical authors intend for us to then say, oh, this is true, this is fitting, this corresponds, because this is the same Son who is begotten from that same Father from all eternity, apart from the world, apart from creation and salvation altogether. So the names, the missions, and then certainly we can get into this in a minute, but certainly then the biblical authors feel quite comfortable alluding in countless ways to this doctrine of eternal generation. I like to call it a mosaic. It's if you go to the scriptures and you just think, I'm just going to look for one title or one particular passage, you actually miss out on the beautiful diversity and mosaic of the way the biblical authors choose to really present a feast before us. And so we see this in all kinds of ways, from John's gospel, where he likes to just use the language of begetting itself, to Paul, who will talk about the Son as the image. Later to the Corinthians, he'll also talk about Christ as the wisdom. I think he's pulling there from Proverbs.
Right.
Matthew's gospel seems to echo that language of Micah, Ancient of Days. And Hebrews, we can't forget Hebrews, of course. Hebrews 1 at the very beginning, when it appeals to Psalm 2, not only describes Christ as the radiance of the glory of God, but then will then turn to the Psalms, not just to say a lot about the mission of the Son, but the eternal origin of this Son, and it does so in a just an extraordinary way. Yeah. I could go on, but I would like to hear from you, because you've written on this topic, and you've made a really key observation that has more to do with translations. And I would love I'd love to hear, but for the sake of our viewers as well, I'm sure they would love to hear, when they open their Bibles, right? They go home, they open their Bibles. Many contemporary versions, when they open a gospel like John, they're just not going to see begetting language there. Yeah. That wasn't always the case. So maybe you could help us understand, why has this language, maybe you could just take some time and walk us through a little bit of the history here. Why is this language of begetting just disappeared from our translations?
Yeah, it is unfortunate. But first, before I explain that, I just want to say that I totally agree with what you've just said, that the biblical basis of the doctrine of eternal generation of the Son is not based simply on the 5 places in the Gospel of John and once in the first epistle of John that use the word only begotten. My own research has been focused primarily on that one word. In Greek, it's the word monogenes, but in the King James Bible and the New American Standard, it's translated as only begotten. So I'll refer to the word only begotten, but I mean the Greek word monogenes. My research is focused on that one word, but that doesn't mean that I think that the whole doctrine stands or falls on that one word. And I agree with you that there's a broader mosaic that underlies this doctrine. And even if we didn't have the word monogenes in the New Testament, we still have all this other context. We have the Father-Son language. We have especially the one you mentioned from Hebrews 1:3. Yeah. That he's the radiance of the glory of God. That's very clear. But I do think that the issue of translation is very important, and it may have contributed to some of the general lack of confidence in the last 100 years or so, the last 50 years maybe, lack of confidence that this doctrine is biblical. The fact that beginning in 1946, the Revised Standard Version, the New Testament, was published in 1946. The full Bible was published a few years later, but in 1946, the RSV was the first major English version that dropped begotten.
Yeah.
Up until that point, everyone used either the King James Bible or the first major revision of that was done in 1885, the English Standard Version. Well, it wasn't the English Standard, but it was the English Revised Version, I believe. And that so from the King James Bible in 1611 all the way up until the late 19th century and then into the early 20th, everyone just saw only begotten in their Bibles.
Yeah.
And they never questioned it. And so it would be easy for Christians in that time period to say eternal generation, eternal begetting is biblical.
Yeah.
But after the RSV came out with that, it did create some controversy, although most of the controversy over the RSV is focused on other passages. But that particular translation did create some controversy. But eventually it took hold. And after the RSV, you have the NIV, which came out in the 1970s. I think, was it 1978 was the first edition of it. The NIV also followed suit. And then, of course, the NIV was the first major English translation that started this whole trend of new contemporary translations of the Bible. And then the floodgates were opened.
Yeah.
And almost all of the major English versions that have come out since then in the last 20 or 30 years have dropped begotten. And the reason for it was because the scholars at that time, so going back to the original RSV, the scholars at that time believed that monogenes had been mistranslated. You can hear in that word mono, which means only, and then genes, the genes ending. They thought that the genes ending didn't mean begotten, but it had to do with a different Greek root that had to do with kind.
Oh.
And so they said monogenes doesn't mean only begotten, it means only one of his kind. And so therefore they said we should translate it as unique or as only, and just leave out the begotten concept. So that's where we're at. And then what I've done in my research is to say, is that really the case? And so going back to not only the etymology, but also looking at the usage of this word in extra biblical Greek, just regular old, Hesiod and Aeschylus and Plato and so on, non-biblical secular Greek, to see how is this word used. And what I discovered was that while there are definitely examples that could be found where monogenes can only be translated as unique, there are also plenty of other cases where it's being used in a familial context, as you said, and it clearly means only child in the sense of not having any siblings. And so the translation only begotten, then the question of then how should we translate the word when we see it in the Gospel of John,
right,
has to be determined by context. Is it a familial context or is it something else? So the examples where it means unique, it's always in a non-familial context.
Okay.
Like Galen, the medical writer, will refer to the liver as a unique organ.
Okay.
Or Clement will refer to the phoenix as a unique creature because there's no other species like it or something. And so it's clearly not referring to the father-son relationship. There's no familial context there.
Yeah.
But so in those cases, unique is the proper translation. But is that the context in John? No, clearly not. In John, it's a familial context.
Yeah.
Every single one of the 5 occurrences of monogenes, John 1:14, John 1:18, John 3:16, John 3:18, and 1 John 4:9, they're all the father-son relationship.
Yeah.
So it does make sense to translate as only begotten in those cases.
You know, you mentioned context, and I mean, you know this more than I do because you're really living in that world. I'm over here trying to, um, you know, work through so many of the theological repercussions, but you're
Yeah.
doing some excellent uh, biblical scholarship, actually digging into the context itself. I think this would be important to talk about because when we assume this, right? When we use words, when we use a word, well, a word can mean a number of things. Um, how do we determine what definition we use? Well, context, the
Yeah.
context of that word in a sentence, in a paragraph. When we're talking like this, where we may use a word that could mean different things, the same word,
Yeah.
but the context in which we are referring to it is definitive. When we, for some reason, when we open the scriptures, maybe this is just a matter of, you know, needing to be kind of retrained in how to read a text. But when we open the scriptures, we sometimes forget that, and we forget that, well, when we're looking at a word, the context is actually quite crucial to deciding how is this to be interpreted.
Yeah.
You've mentioned, of course, those usages in John's gospel, but even in other texts in John, well, even if the word itself is not used, the idea
Right.
seems to be present. I think, for example, of a passage like John 5, in which Jesus gets himself in all kinds of trouble because he makes this just bold claim after he performs this miracle, this healing of a crippled man on the Sabbath. He makes this bold claim that, well, as my Father is working until now, so am I. And the religious leaders seem to understand at least something of what he is actually saying. There's all kinds of discussions as to, you know, exactly in Jewish literature, exactly how to understand God's activity after creation. I think that there's at least agreement that yes, he rested after creating, but nonetheless, he is the creator, so he continues to sustain and uphold the world. It's possible that that type of background could be present in this whole pretty fierce dialogue between Jesus and the religious leaders, as he's saying, yes, I know it's the Sabbath, but who am I? And who is it that sustains and even heals his creation, even on the Sabbath? Their reaction seems to say, okay, they understand he's saying something about divinity here, and he's saying something about his Father in a way that we wouldn't. So that being the case, I mean, if you keep reading in John 5, it's this context then that becomes so important for when Jesus then makes, you know, the ultimate statement that just as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son life in himself. In the past, and commentators have looked at that and kind of pretty quickly glossed over it. More recently, though, these in John's gospel, like you're saying, the context seems to say, well, this is a familial father-son type of context.
Yeah.
Could you, I mean, is your thinking through this language of begetting, maybe, we see it immediately in John 1. John starts off talking about the word, but then as he continues, he then moves to this type of language of father language, of son language, a very begetting language. By the time you get to John 5, it's almost like John, this is just the context in which he operates, as he then starts to introduce Jesus and Jesus's major statements about his eternal origin from the Father.
Yeah.
Maybe you could speak to this. What is going on here with context, and how is it so crucial?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the arguments that some of I call them revisionist scholars, the ones that don't agree with the translation only begotten and want to translate it as only, one of the arguments that they make, and it's a false argument, but one of the arguments they make is that nowhere else in the writings of John is there any reference to the Father begetting the Son. And it seems to me that John 5:26 is pretty clear.
Yeah.
I mean, what does it mean for a father to give life to a son?
Yeah.
It doesn't use the word beget. It uses the different construction of to give life. But what does that mean for a father to give life to a son? Isn't that the concept of begetting?
Yeah.
So it seems obvious to me that you do have, that there is this context in the Gospel of John of this father-son relationship, not just in terms of a relationship of love or a relationship of authority, but something we could even say ontological, of the Father giving life to the Son and the Son claiming that he has divine power and authority because of that relationship, of origin, not a relationship of love per se. That is part of it, but it's a relationship of origin, or relation of origin, maybe even is a better way to put it, to get away from the sort of social Trinitarian implications of the word relationship. The word relationship is so overused in theology, it bothers me. But anyway, relation of origin is more accurate. So the context of the whole Gospel of John is, in my opinion, it is very clear, like you said, that this is a major issue. I mean, even going back to what you said before, which I thought was brilliant. I had never really thought about this before, but you're focusing on John 5:17, where Jesus says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And immediately it says, verse 18, "This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." So it's very clear that he's referring to his relationship to the Father, and calling himself the Son of the Father isn't focused solely on the relational aspect of that. It's focused on the ontological implications of that, and the fact that he is making himself equal with God because of his claim to originate from God in this ontological way that sets him on the creator side of the creator-creature distinction. And so the whole context then is just so powerful in making it clear that the father-son relationship in the Gospel of John has an ontological focus that really does confirm the concept of eternal generation in the sense of being begotten from the Father's essence. So,
so important, right? I mean, so crucial. It makes me think that when we come to a passage like John 5, we really could use some help. I mean, when we look at the fathers, I mean, their exegesis, it's not only lengthy, but they seem to understand exactly what you just said, that John, this language seems to very much assume and even create controversy with Jesus, because it is ontological.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the reasons why then they feel so comfortable not only referring to eternal generation to say, this is why we call him son,
Hmm.
and this is why we then call the Father Father. This is his, as you just mentioned, his eternal relation of origin.
Hmm.
But then they also feel just as comfortable to sort of flip that coin over to the other side and say, on the basis of this type of language in John 5, oh, this is also why Jesus seems to think he is equal to his
Yeah.
Father.
Yeah.
So it's
And
not as
that
explicit.
claim is blasphemous, in their
That's
mind.
right.
You're claiming to be God. It's like you got to pick up stones. If his claim is false, and if
Yeah.
he really is not the eternal Son of God in the sense of being equal with God, then yeah, you ought to pick up stones right there on the spot. I mean, that's blasphemy.
They
So
seem to understand
yeah,
something of that. Um, there's been discussions over, do they understand that in full and part? Well, regardless, they understand enough to say Jesus is saying something,
right.
um, saying something very ontological here.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that I noticed in the church fathers is going back to John 1. So the
Yeah.
first two occurrences of monogenes in John 1:14 and John 1:18, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Mm.
And then verse 18, no one has ever seen God, the only begotten God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Those two occurrences of only begotten are in the context of, again, going back to this issue of context, which is so
Yeah.
critical. Just like you saw how John 5:26 is in the context of this discussion over what Jesus claimed to be equal with the Father because of that claim in verse 17 that my Father is working and I am working as well. Same thing here in John 1
Mm.
because of the context of verse 3,
Right.
where you have the clear creator-creature distinction, and then John in the prologue places the word on the creator side
Ah.
of the creator-creature distinction
Yeah.
and says all things were made through him.
Yeah.
And without him was not anything made that was made. And so now at this point, he hasn't used the word only begotten. He's just used the word,
Yeah.
the word.
Yeah.
He's calling him the word and saying that God made all things through the word,
Mm.
but that places the word on the creator side of the creator-creature distinction.
Yeah.
So that then when you follow through the text and you come to verse 14 and it says, and the word, the same word that we just talked about in verse 3 that was on the creator side, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only begotten.
Right. Right.
And so that then tells you that he's begotten, not made,
Yeah.
because he's the creator, not the creature.
Yeah.
And so the church fathers, in my reading of the church fathers, this seemed to be this context here of John 1:3 tied to John 1:14 and 18 seemed to be the basis, not the only basis, but a major part of the basis for their claim in the Nicene Creed that he's begotten and not made.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. How you just walked us through John 1. I hope people will take note of that because going back to the 4th century, right? This was
Yeah.
the major exegetical divide.
Yeah.
Was what side of creation is he on? Are we putting him with the creator or the creature? John assumes right out of the gate, he makes it very clear. And I think the fathers are right then as they sort of inch up on verses 14 and 15, which are then going to start introducing this father-son language. But even before that, right out of the gate, they're noticing, oh, he's actually identifying the son as the Word. He's using that language as the very one who is with God, who was God. This is not so that when he then uses the language of creating through his Son, it's not as if like Arius thought, well, this is a subordinate
Right.
type of being. No, this is well, as the fathers like to say, the Father created through his Son by his Spirit. They have no room for that type of subordinationist move.
No, they have no room. And the text is explicit that all things were made through him, that is through the Word, and without him was not anything made that was made.
Yeah.
So if he's a creature, if he's one of the things that was made, then it would become self-referential, and he would be making himself through, right? So it's not possible. It's the text itself rules out any kind of concept that the Word is a created being, even if he's the most glorious first creature that God made, and he's almost greater than an angel and just the most godlike creature, but he's still on the created side of the creator creature distinction according to Arianism, and that doesn't solve your problem. So yeah, to me, John 1:3 sets the whole context for not just the rest of the prologue, but even John 5, like you were saying. So it's critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe and we've been talking about John's gospel, and boy, we could go on, couldn't we? We talk about John 3, John 10. There's so much, and it's John's gospel is just so rich for these very reasons, not just in terms of Christology, but Trinitarian theology. Maybe we could transition to Paul as well, to sort of pull back the curtain on this mosaic just a little bit more. We may not be able to get to see the whole mosaic just in our conversation, but if we go to Paul, for example, in Colossians 1, or we could even talk about the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 1. Here again, in different ways, we see similar, if not the same, type of concepts and points that John was making.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because Colossians 1:15, he's the image of the invisible God, for by him all things were created. Hebrews 1:3, actually verse 2 first, that through whom all things were made, right? God has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. And then verse 3, he's the radiance of the glory of God. Yeah. So in both of those, just like in John 1, you have this issue of all things being created through the second person of the Trinity. And then immediately in that context, like the next verse or the next line, some kind of statement about eternal generation. Yeah. Right? Radiance, image. But it's right in the context of saying that through him, all things were created.
That's right.
Putting him on the creator side.
Yeah.
So he's not a creature. And so therefore, this eternal generation concept, whether it's defined as sonship or radiance or image or whatever metaphor you want to use, is clearly stating his ontological origin, that he is begotten from the Father's essence and is therefore has the same essence and the same nature as the Father.
Yeah. Yeah, the language that the author of Hebrews and then Paul, the language that they use is so strategic.
Yeah.
As well. Like you're saying, not only does it make it very clear the eternal origin, the eternal relational origin of the Son, but in a different way from John, the same concept is present, and like you said, with different metaphors. I mean, I take Hebrews, for example. This concept of radiance again, I sometimes worry that we use it so flippantly. Um, even in our own church settings, that we don't actually stop and ask ourselves, well, what does this actually say about the Son? If we go back to and start digging through some of the exegesis of our fathers, or look at the Nicene Creed, for example, they seem to allude to it everywhere.
Yeah.
You think of the Creed where it says, after, this is in the context of the Creed's affirmation of eternal generation, and it has this 3 words where it says, light, he is light of light. And it'll also speak of him as true God of true God, and all kinds of other ways. But why this phrase, light of light? I think they are picking up on this very concept, this very language, that he is the radiance of this divine glory. And if that doesn't if that doesn't convey in its own way this concept of this eternal relation, this in John's language, this eternal begetting, I don't know what will. And of course, it certainly conveys not just Hebrews will go on to then use the language of sonship, right? So it's obviously the author's going to distinguish the Son as Son, but right from the beginning, as you mentioned, to describe him as the radiance of the glory of God. Well, this is saying something about his equality with the Father. It's fascinating, and maybe we can talk about this too. The context of Hebrews 1, right, is so fascinating, because there seems to be a really specific agenda here. Why all this talk of angels, for example, as you start to get further into Hebrews 1, the author seems really bent on demonstrating, no, this is not another creature. This is not even another angelic being. He's not subordinate in any of those ways. Rather, this is the very radiance of divine glory. And I think in that context, the author of Hebrews, in order to show the Son's superiority over the angelic beings, the author is also then bringing us into the context of eternity itself. Sometimes we miss that because, obviously the rest of Hebrews is going to have a lot to say about history, right? Redemptive history and priesthood and sacrifice and temple. And that's going to be a large part of its focus. But not all that unlike John's gospel, the author starts off talking about metaphysics.
Right.
And isn't it interesting that in that eternal metaphysical ontological rooted opening, he's going to transition from radiance language to then begetting language to out of Psalm 2. Hebrews is just overwhelming. You can see there's just so much going on. Why introduce begetting language out of Psalm 2? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is interesting that he quotes Psalm 2:7, "You are my son, today I've begotten you," in verse 5, but he also quotes it again in chapter 5 and verse 5. And in both contexts, it seems to be setting the context for the incarnation. It's similar to John 1, where you start off with the pre-existent Son, the pre-existent Word, and then you turn to, then the Word became flesh. And I think you see something similar in Hebrews, of focusing on the eternal generation of the Son, and then turning to incarnation and how, Hebrews 2 focuses a lot on incarnation, that, this whole issue of, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things. Also in Hebrews 5, after affirming the eternal generation of the Son, then it says, but then in the days of his flesh, verse 7 of chapter 5, and it talks about his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then how he learned obedience through the things that he suffered so that he could become the source of eternal salvation and become our great high priest. So it seems like the author of Hebrews is doing basically what the Gospel of John is doing, which is starting off with, who is this? We can focus on the historical side first, because that's our experience of it. The Messiah has come into the world. He lived a perfect life. He died on the cross for our sins. He rose again. He's seated at the right hand of God. But who is this person? Who is this Savior, this mediator, this high priest? Well, to really understand that, you have to go back before the incarnation to his eternal relationship to the Father. And then that anchors him in this eternal ontological relationship, so that we have a Savior who is fully human, but also fully divine. And that power that he brings in our salvation. He's not only the author of creation, he's the author of the new creation.
Right.
So.
This transition you're talking about, I think it's so important, right? When in Hebrews 1, you start to feel that transition taking place. But within the context there, when the author then goes back to Psalm 2, right? And when we look at Psalm 2, again, this is such a rich passage where you have a conversation taking place, really, in which God is then speaking and describing the reign and the rule and the victory that he's going to give to his anointed one. But it's almost as if David is overhearing, if we could put it that way, not just a conversation that has implications for salvation history. It certainly does. And Psalm 2, the rest of Psalm 2 is going to make that clear. But David seems to indicate he's overhearing a divine conversation, one in which transcends our time, space, universe, and history itself. And as he then introduces that language of, in Psalm 2, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Like you're indicating, there seems to be something more there than just, oh, this has to do with, what's going to take place in terms of kingship and the reign and rule. No, this seems to be referring to something eternal, even something that transcends that entire context. Now, I do have to admit to you, I'm cheating a little bit here, because I do have Augustine sitting here in front of me, and I can't help but look at how he looks at this passage, right? If you don't mind, I'll just read. It's just a couple sentences. I can't resist. He says this. He says the word today denotes and here he's talking about that language, right, of Psalm 2, where today I've begotten you. He says, well, what does this mean? If David's overhearing this divine eternal conversation with ramifications for history and salvation, what does this mean, though, in terms of the son's identity? He says this: the word today denotes the actual present, and as in eternity, nothing is past as if it had ceased to be, nor future as if it had not yet come to pass, but all is simply present, since whatever is eternal is ever in being. The words today I've begotten you are to be understood of the divine generation. In this phrase, the Orthodox Catholic belief proclaims the eternal generation of the power and wisdom of God, who is the only begotten Son.
Wow.
That is a remarkable statement by
Yes,
Augustine.
it is.
He's basically saying, don't be too quick to think that this begetting is just the Father sending the Son as King and Messiah and anointed one in history. Augustine is saying, hold on, this eternal conversation that David's overhearing, this says something about the Son's eternal relation of origin before creation and salvation altogether. And then he gets, gets to John on us, right, where he starts to use the language of begetting, and even wisdom, which is very Pauline, in Proverbs 8 and 1 Corinthians, where Paul starts to use this language of wisdom as well. Anyway, I had to cheat there and bring in Augustine to our conversation.
Well, that's one of the things I appreciate about your book, because I recognized that quote as soon as you started reading it. I said, I think I just read that yesterday. Oh yeah, it was in your book. So you pulled together so many great quotes from the church fathers that really help to, it's not that you're quoting them as authoritative. You're saying, obviously we believe in sola scriptura, but you're saying that let's listen to how our heroes in the faith who have gone before us, how they read the scriptures. And sometimes they bring to bear a certain perspective and a certain way of connecting certain verses together and a certain way of looking at them in terms of their basic metaphysical commitments. I think that's a big part of it, because they approach things with a more metaphysical framework than we do. We focus as moderns on history, but they think about eternity and metaphysics and ontology a little bit more. And that helps to shed light on what the scriptures are saying. And suddenly you realize, wow, once you reframe it in that perspective, it is there in the text. I see it now. I didn't see it before because I'm looking at it from my modern historical lens. But when I put on the lens of the church fathers, I see it. It makes sense. It's not an alien imposition on the text. It is in the text. So,
well, that might be just the right note to sound as we conclude our conversation here. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about John. We've kind of just barely gotten into Hebrews 1 and Psalm 2. You mentioned, of course, Colossians 1, where it talks about Christ as the image of the invisible God. Others, I mean, maybe those watching want to dig deeper. They could certainly spend time reading Proverbs 8 and the way that the Son is also referred to as the wisdom of God. And how fascinating, right? That this is the same language that Paul will use when he refers to Christ as the wisdom of God when he's writing to the Corinthians.
That's right.
I don't, that doesn't seem to be accidental. And of course, in Paul, he's not going to take an Arian reading of of Proverbs 8. We know who he thinks this Son is. Or maybe some of our viewers want to look at Micah chapter 5, this incredible language of Ancient of Days. And isn't it interesting when you open Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 2, who is this Ancient of Days? Well, it's none other than Jesus Christ. And Micah seems to think that this is the Ancient of Days from eternity. That says volumes about the way that Matthew then just assumes, right? Almost in passing, just assumes this language of this this newborn Messiah. Of course, so much of this, right, has to do with the gospel. I mean, you've kind of hinted at that in various ways. We're not just talking about a doctrine for the sake of the doctrine itself, but hopefully people can sense that when you get to the Gospels or the epistles, as they present the gospel, this is essential. This is really, really key. And you almost get the impression that if you don't have this foundation, if they don't have this foundation, John 1, Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, well, the gospel of the Son is not, you're going to miss out, if we can put that way, on the great riches it gives to us. But I guess the last thing I want to say is, we've been talking about simply Trinity, but I would love to point people to your work. You've written a chapter in a book called Retrieving Eternal Generation.
Mm-hmm.
What's the name of the chapter title?
It's called A Lexical Defense of the Johannine Only Begotten.
Okay.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. This is in a book by Scott Swain, edited by Scott Swain and Fred Sanders.
Right.
And so look for chapter 5 by Irons in that book. I've read it, I think, twice now, and some of the insights you've brought up in this conversation come through there as well, and it is it's worth your time. There's more coming out. If I can hint at this, you are also writing a chapter for a book I'm editing on the doctrine of Trinity with IVP Academic, that is looking at the biblical witness to this doctrine of eternal generation, building on your past research, but of course expanding it even more. And I'm also, I think I can say this, I'm also really glad to hear that you're working on a book project as well.
Yes.
And so we're looking forward to that.
Yep, doing more research on Only Begotten and in the Church Fathers, and hopefully it'll be my main concern is I feel that these English versions that we have now, beginning with the RSV and continuing with all the plethora of modern English versions that leave out begotten, is that they are now out of sync with the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
And then that raises the question of, then is the Nicene Creed unbiblical?
Yeah.
To not only refer to the Son as only begotten, but then to make a big deal out of it and say, begotten, not made, and therefore he's light of light, and therefore he's homoousios with the Father of the same substance. It seems like they're hanging the whole argument on it, Yeah. And so if our English Bibles and our creed are out of sync with each other, that creates a disconnect that is going to make people wonder if the creed is even right. Yeah. And so maybe we need to go back to the way things were before, before 1946, where the creed and the Bible, the English Bible, were in sync with one another.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think you're onto something there. And until that happens, it does put us in this awkward situation, right? Where we obviously want Christians to read their Bibles. We want pastors to preach from their Bibles, but we're also a bit nervous that they're not the translations they have, if they're not accurate, and if they're not conveying not just accuracy, right, but conveying these crucial Trinitarian truths,
right,
then that certainly, well, it not only makes you worry, okay, are Christians then understanding everything they need to understand from what should be there in their Bible translations, but more than that, from a bigger perspective, okay, then if they start being theologically minded, even historically minded, this is going to put them at odds unnecessarily with one of the most, maybe the most important creed of the Christian faith, the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
So
I have this feeling, this fear, this sense that most of these, I don't have a problem with these modern translations. I'm not like one of these people that says you got to go back to the King James only and the NIV
Right.
is apostate and all that. I don't have that same antipathy towards the modern English translations. Most of them are pretty accurate. But the thing is that there's this feeling, this fear, this sense that too many of these English versions are being created in a context that's not from the church and for the church. In other words, who is making these translations and why are they making them? It doesn't seem to be the church making them, and it doesn't seem that they're making them for the church. It seems often that they're just being made for the world in general, just so that anybody off the street could pick up a Bible, or anybody in a hotel could pick up a Bible and understand it. That's a laudable goal, but maybe we need to get back to the church-focused idea. And if we did, then that would help us to realize that we do have a big problem on our hands. But the church confesses the Nicene Creed. If a church does not, then they're not a true church, right? To be a Christian church, you have to confess the Nicene Creed. And if the church confesses the Nicene Creed, then the church needs to have a Bible that is made by the church and for the church that is consistent with the church's creed.
Yeah.
So that's my concern and my fear.
I think that type of transparency is needed today, and it might be painful for some people to hear, but it's a good type of honesty that will help us actually reform.
Mm-hmm.
And like you're just saying, goodness, that doing theology for the church in the context of the church is the way that theology and Bible translation and biblical studies is the way that it was done for many, many centuries.
Yep.
I think it's actually quite modern that it's only been in recent days, in recent decades, that we've seen more of a dichotomy between the two. And we're starting to sense some of the unfortunate consequences of that. It doesn't mean that if we return to that ancient model, that marriage that you're talking about, it doesn't mean that we lessen our academic rigor. Hopefully people can sense by our conversation, no, we actually want to increase it.
Yeah.
But for what purpose, right? For what purpose? And here we're trying to emphasize, let's get our Bible translations right so that not just our reading of Scripture, but our theology of Scripture actually reflects true Nicene Trinitarian theology in a way that, as you mentioned, preserves fidelity to orthodoxy itself. Right. If that is not done, it makes you wonder, well, have we strayed then? Have we drifted then from what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, by which he didn't mean minimalism, right. But faithful Orthodox Christianity itself. Hey, this has been fun, hasn't it?
Yes.
It's good to do this sort of thing, especially during COVID.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for writing this book, Simply Trinity. It's going to be a real contribution that I think is going to help the church to shore up our understanding of the Trinity and to make sure that we really are. And it's not enough just to say, I believe in the Trinity in the sense of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What does that mean? Yeah. And understanding eternal generation, I think, as you argue in the book, is not just an optional one way of understanding the Trinity. I think that you're arguing in the book that it's really the linchpin of it.
Yeah.
And that if you don't get that right, you're not going to understand the Trinity correctly.
Yeah.
So
Thank you so much. That's extremely encouraging. This as an author, you almost shed your own blood to
you
try
do.
to put words on paper. You bleed all
Yeah.
over it.
And I know you've put so much research into it, and I can tell from reading that you have labored extensively,
Yeah.
not superficially, but extensively in the church fathers.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you weren't able to use all of your research.
Yeah.
I know how it is. Much of it will be left on the editing floor, but
painful, isn't it? So painful.
Thank you so much though for doing that, because that's
Yeah.
what we need. We really need that. And I really appreciated all of those quotes from, you called them the dream team of your theologians that you're quoting, and it's very helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's so encouraging to hear. And yeah, I basically immersed myself
I could tell.
in the patristics, and it was painful when I realized I have enough here for probably 5 books.
Yeah.
Oh, what am I gonna do?
Right.
And so the sometimes people don't realize this, but writing, half of it is the painful process of editing. And,
it is.
But in the end, I'm so encouraged because, really, my motive with this book is not for people, even in the end game, to read me, but maybe this can be a launching pad,
right,
to go and, of course, read the text that we've been talking about in Scripture, but do so with the church and for the church.
Right.
And I think you're right. I think that if we can start, whether it's translations, commentaries, or theological works like this, if we can start doing that together, even, hopefully, Lord willing, we'll start to see the type of orthodox fidelity to a Nicene Trinitarianism that we know is needed. Hey, I appreciate you taking time, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it.